Welcome and everyone who just joined. We'll be starting in a few minutes, waiting for the rest of participants to join us. All right, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar, Reform or Regress. We'll be talking about the World Bank Evolution Roadmap and the Bridgetown agenda. So we are very happy to have you here today. My name is Rebecca Thissen. I work for CNCD 1111, which is one of Eurodat's member, and I'm a policy advisor on climate justice. So I will be your moderator today, and I will try to lead you through this session. So we thought it would be interesting to have this session prior to the spring meetings, who are starting just next week, to discuss several things, because we believe that it's very important to build capacity among different networks, finance networks, development networks, climate networks, to understand better and unpack what's actually currently on the table regarding the World Bank Evolution Roadmap, the Bridgetown agenda. It's also very timely because there are many rolling discussions regarding the hasty nomination of the World Bank new president in March 2023, the upcoming Macron summit in June in Paris, the COP27 decision regarding the World Bank and the IMF, and so on and so forth. So we have many things to discuss today, and the idea really is to not hesitate to ask any question, to understand better, to unpack all those very technical but also very key questions. And so in that regard, we will start with a context given by Farwa Ciel, who is a senior policy advisor and advocacy officer on development finance at Eurodat. She will lead you through a short presentation to really give us an analysis of the context, the current trends, and what we need to be aware of. And then we'll have a discussion with our great panelists that I will introduce you to in a minute. So around different questions that we wanted to ask them, we will have a 1 hour discussion. And then, of course, very important, you will have the floor. You can put your question in the little Q&A box down your screen, and then we will address your question to the panelists to make sure that after 2 hours, everybody is a beginning expert of those very important questions. So our speakers today are first Professor Celine, who is Professor of International Economic Law at the University of Warwick. Welcome, Professor. Very nice to have you today. Then we have Buenaventura, who is a senior program manager for debt and green economic building at APMDD, so Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Welcome, Mai. Very happy to have you as well. And lastly, we have Rodolfo Lahoy, who is a policy communication training team head at IBON International. Good to know also that IBON just released a very important paper called World Bank Reform, a view from the Global South. And I think it's also very nice to read it to frame the different issues and recommendations that we should have in mind regarding this topic. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Farwa to give us a short presentation on the context. Farwa, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks a lot to Rebecca for hosting and for our panelists for accepting. It was a very short notice. And as Rebecca said, this is before the spring meetings. So I think it helps us better to understand what's happening, as there are so many things happening. The slide is now being shared, and before I start, I wanted to say that this meeting is being recorded, just for you to know, and it will be shared afterwards as well. So I'm going to be very short and provide a very basic overview of what's happening with the World Bank's evolution roadmap, linking it to the broader MDB or Multilateral Development Bank reform agenda. Next slide, please. So I will start with an introduction and the background, followed by key characteristics of the evolution roadmap, followed by a framing of the bigger picture, looking at the Bridgetown initiative and France's new financial pact. Both of these, of course, are evolving. And as I said, it's a very basic introduction, but we are hoping to send documents after this meeting, which has a very detailed background reading on all the issues addressed here. Next slide, please. So the World Bank Evolution Roadmap came out in October 2022 when G7 nations called on the World Bank management to have a reformed or evolved agenda. And the main reason for that was to broaden its mandate, the World Bank's mandate, to encompass interlinked global challenges, including climate change, fragility, and of course, pandemic-related threats. There are two documents to look at. The first is the draft evolution roadmap, which was submitted to the World Bank's executive board in late December 2022, and this has now been updated with a report, with the version which is a report to the governors, which came out just recently in March 2023. The background to this document is another document, which is the G20's commissioned independent review of multilateral development banks' capital adequacy framework. And this is a document which is called Boosting MDBs Investing Capacity, an independent review of multilateral banks' capital adequacy frameworks. The main objective of this review was to enable shareholders to consider adaptations to the current frameworks in order to maximize MDB's financing capacity and building on this old idea of unlocking hundreds of billions of dollars in additional lending. Just for your information, the capital adequacy ratio is a measure of how much capital a bank has available, reported as a percentage of a bank's risk-weighted credit exposure. So basically, this is just to establish that banks have enough capital on reserve to handle a certain amount of losses before being at risk or, for example, for being insolvent. It's important to mention that there were 5 recommendations of this report, which focused on redefining approaches to risk tolerance, focusing on making use of something known as callable capital or a portion of MDB's subscribed capital, which is not paid in by shareholders and actually in a way it's lying idle. So how to better make use of that capital. Then the third was expanding the uses of financial innovations, improving credit rating agency assessment, and increasing the access of multilateral banks' data analysis. So in a way, this is important to mention because in the past, the so-called evolution has already happened in the World Bank. So for example, the IBRD lending, which is potentially enhanced to $550 billion now through the evolution, is not the first because these reforms happened in 2014 and 2018. But what's really happening here is G20 proposal are also aimed at expanding the financial architecture of lending. So this is a concerted move which needs to be analyzed on all accounts. Next slide, please. So what are the key characteristics of these of the evolution roadmap, and what does it actually mean? These are some very basic and selected points, but I think that these are the points to emphasize, and I hope our panelists will build on these. The first is there is an emphasis on middle-income countries, and this is actually, if you frame it right, it's actually in a way in opposition to lower-income countries. If you heard the forthcoming President Banga's address yesterday, which was hosted by Center for Global Development, he had a very interesting explanation for a focus on middle-income countries, which I encourage you to listen to. This emphasis on middle-income countries is also followed by the reframing of or not reframing, or framing of global public goods. So goods which are of value to everyone and which have of a use value which cannot be defined, but it is very important. And climate was an emphasis in this document. Of course, what does the definition of global public good actually means is something we will discuss with our panelists. In addition, there is emphasis on scaling of finances from all sources. So there is an emphasis on domestic resource mobilization, and this entails a hybrid form of public-private partnerships to trigger domestic private investment, followed by an emphasis on domestic tax systems, but through the help of international development finance. At the same time as before, there is an emphasis on enhanced role for the private sector. And this is a quote from the document that MDBs will play an intermediary role here through private capital enabling reforms, and active fundraising from private and institutional investors. Finally, the domestic capital markets will be strengthened to crowd in local private sectors. And there is an emphasis on concessional resources, which, for example, includes blended finance. On the right, there's an image of the objectives as well as objectives of the evolution roadmap, as well as the objectives of the financial model. These go into a bit of technical detail, but actually in a way they're addressing all the points which I've mentioned on the left, which is that they might lower the IBRD's minimum equity to loan ratio to enhance lending capacity. They would increase the limit to shareholders guarantee, and strengthen crisis response capacity, have a multi-donor replenishable trust fund, which is called the Scaling Climate Action or SCALE fund. But these are technical details which actually speak to these broader reforms that I mentioned on the left. Next slide, please. So if we think about the World Bank's evolution roadmap, it's not in isolation. It's happening with some other developments which are coming from different stakeholders. The first example is the Bridgetown initiative, which is very popular at the moment. It was proposed by the Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley. And the goal was to break this deadlock over climate finance, which is a source of disagreement between developing and developed countries. And the idea was to propose a global climate mitigation trust fund which is backed by $500 billion in SDRs for climate and development. I have a definition of SDRs for those who are not aware. It's simply an international reserve asset, originally created by the IMF to help member countries facing balance of payment crisis, and are distributed on grounds of countries' IMF quotas. The two special things about the SDRs are that they do not create debt for recipient countries, and they come with no conditionalities. So in this Bridgetown initiative, the idea is that the SDRs will drive private investment into transition projects in lower middle income countries. And one thing to add, of course, is that this is just one aspect of Bridgetown which makes it salient, but there are other aspects. For example, there is the disaster clause, which can be called upon for countries when they're in climate distress, for example. And of course, this will become more concrete, hopefully after the springs. In addition to the Bridgetown, there is also the new Global Financial Pact, which France will announce in the 2023 June summit. So it's going to happen in June, and it's very much aligned with the Bridgetown initiative. And it has 4 aims and 4 working groups, which are what we know so far, because there's not much information, and they focus on very similar things, which is restoring fiscal space for countries to face short-term difficulties, foster private sector development, then, of course, encourage investment in green infrastructure, mobilize innovative financing for countries vulnerable to climate change, and so on. And as I said, these initiatives have to be looked as a whole, because they are not simply enhancing financing, which is, of course, a bank's job, the World Bank, as well as instruments such as a Bridgetown or funds, but it's reforming or reformulating the international financial architecture. And next slide, please. So based on these developments, we have 3 questions for our panelists. 2 of them focus on the idea of more lending, as well as the private sector, private sector's role in this. And finally, the third one is looking at climate. And I hope we have a very interesting discussion on these with our panelists. And this will also, of course, followed by a Q&A from the audience. So please also have your questions ready. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Power. So I think the question will be shared as well with you in the chat, so you can read them while listening to the speakers, because they are quite long and complex, but the issue is complex, so it was needed to have a broad questions. Maybe I'll read them quickly out loud for you to have an understanding of what we want to ask to the speakers, and then I'll give the floor to each speaker for 10 minutes. So the first question is, I can put maybe the camera on. Yes. Oh, yes. Hello again. So the World Bank roadmap is focused on enhancing its financing capacity, which is actually framed as a reformist and progressive step forward. In parallel, the Bridgetown agenda calls for increasing MDBs financing to low-income countries. We just discussed this. Is more financing the answer, especially given the escalating debt situation and the fact that there is no effective multilateral debt resolution mechanism in place? So is more money an answer or a problem? So that's the first question. Second question, how does the World Bank roadmap build on the billions to trillions agenda? Given the previous evidence of leveraging private finance, do you think that the private sector finance will be effectively delivered through the roadmap? How does the World Bank vision of development, which focusing, we know, strongly on market instrument, fit with the current idea of reform of evolution? So a big question about the private sector and leveraging private finance. So that's the first round of questions. So I'll give the floor first to Professor Celine Tan, please, for 10 minutes, and then I'll give the floor to the next speakers. Celine Tan, you have the floor. Thank you. Maybe Rodolfo, you can start first, as I see Professor Tan is not there for the moment. So if you don't mind going first, and then we'll switch the order.
All right. Hi, everyone. Rodolfo here from IBON International. What I would like to, and apologies, I don't have a set of slides to share, but what I wish to mostly highlight throughout my portions in this webinar is a political perspective of how the current evolution roadmap fits into the broader political-economic context and the history of the dominant economic model that has been promoted by the World Bank for decades, as we know. And to answer the first question, we know that the roadmap, the rationale for additional financing capacity is not just about the money, right? It's about, and I quote here, for the World Bank to continue to play a central role in development and climate finance. So financing is its own end, rather, but it's a means to reaffirm the current legitimacy of the bank in a time where the paradigm that it has promoted for so long is been exposed by the pandemic and the concomitant crises that we are feeling today. So when we ask, right, so is more financing the answer? For us at IBON International, coming from the Global South, the questions that we throw back is that what kind of financing? Financing for what? For whom? And what is the political-economic context in which we are talking about more financing? And we know that the World Bank is, when you read World Bank documents and the evolution roadmap itself, it would admit that there's a dangerous debt situation, but we know in practice that it's not doing anything significant to respond to it. We know that the debt structure of the countries that are most affected by the climate crisis is as follows, right? 36% of the debts that they owe are to private creditors, 20% just to the World Bank, and another 20% to other MDBs. And those three creditors alone make up 3/4 of the debts that are being owed by the 55 countries most affected by the climate crisis. So in this regard, is it really a progressive step forward if we're talking about more loans today, especially loans that even in the recent years still have conditionalities, such as loans that the World Bank calls development policy financing, which I think consisted around 30% of the bank's financing in the recent years. So for us, it should be actually an opportunity, this question about financing, to talk about the, like Afarwa alluded to, the unequal power structures and the problems in the financial architecture, the system of winners and losers that has been created by the dominant economic model through World Bank financing. So we have to get back to that reality. And for us, what is the reality? Is it really a reality of more money or more colonial wealth transfers? You perhaps it would be useful to talk about here a study from 2021 by Hickel, Sullivan, and Zoom-Kawala, who found that across more than five decades, from 1960 to 2017, around 152 trillion US dollars or 142 trillion euros worth of resources has been drained from the global south. And where did this lost wealth go? It went to the United States, followed by Germany and Japan as the top three beneficiaries. And coincidentally, the United States is the biggest shareholder of the World Bank. And that study also demonstrates that the wealth drains increased actually during the era of structural adjustment, which in case you don't know, those are the decades where the World Bank, together with the IMF, started and actively promoted privatizing of state assets, the deregulation of economies, and the liberalization of southern markets to benefit foreign capital. So we think those are the things that are unaddressed by the so-called evolution and the talk about financing. Is it really more money, or is there silence about the trillions that have been taken away from the global south after the decades of World Bank interventions? So that's my answer to the first question.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. I'll give now the floor to Professor Dan to give also her answer to those first questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. And sorry, I just dropped out. My internet dropped out, unfortunately. So I think it's really great that Rodolfo brought up the issue of the structural and systemic issues, because I think we need to roll back. And I think Fawa kind of mentioned the whole evolution roadmap in the context of the bigger picture and all the financial, the other initiatives that are happening. I think it's important for us to roll back every time, new permutations and new operational policies and new strategic documents come out to the massive global asymmetries that happen because they're structural legacies. It's slavery, it's colonialism, it's post-colonial extraction, it's the climate debt that's built up. So I think in all that, it's been legitimized by these global economic institutions like the World Bank, but also international economic law in terms of international investment, trade law, and the policies of the multilateral development agencies. So I think we need to kind of like look at that holistically in the round that rich countries are where they are because there's been continued exploitation or extraction of resources from the south, and also greater policy flexibility during the time of their industrial development, which then later became kicking away the ladder in Hadrien Tang's words of the global south. So I think one this has to be contextualized within that. There is a financing gap because there are these asymmetries. There are asymmetries of climate vulnerability to climate change, where developing countries are much more vulnerable. There's issue with continued lack of financing due to trade and investment barriers, and there is also the issue of the debt structure, and all this has been exacerbated by the pandemic and climate change. And I think what's happened is as a result of these sort of structural asymmetries, and importantly, the regulatory gaps at the international financial at the international level in terms of international financial regulation, but also in terms of trade and investment regimes. These kinds of regulatory gaps and regulatory asymmetries have led to a situation where there is this financing gap. And the financing gap is always about, plugging it through international public finance. So, MDB lending going up because there's a financing gap in countries. What is not being addressed in this entire conversation, every time we go through different rounds of we need more money, is why are developing countries in this situation in the first place? Why are developing countries spending so much money on debt service? Because there's no comprehensive debt restructuring mechanism at the international level. Why are developing countries not able to raise resources at the domestic level? There could all sorts of structural issues, including issues of trade barriers, including asymmetries in international investment law in terms of the tax evasion. There's loads of these questions which are so prominent, and I don't see that being addressed in these kinds of financial conversations. So I think we need to, for me, it's a question of, yes, there is a financing gap, but why is there a financing gap, and can it be addressed through pumping more money into this issue? So I think number one, we need to roll back and we look at the regulatory gaps and how we meet them, and I think it's problematic because and I can talk about it in the next few questions that we're going to answer. But I think the main gap I see in the roadmap is that they're not addressing the other multilateral regimes that they need to. So they talk a lot about climate, but there's not a single reference to the multilateral climate regime, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Paris Agreement. And that's really highly problematic because, it isn't about, real genuine engagement with, what are the causes of the, development crisis and climate crisis in developing countries. So I think I'll stop there, but I can elaborate on these points later.
Thank you very much, Professor Tan. Mai, I'll give you the floor now to fill this first round of questions. You have 10
Yes.
minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much. And it's really very nice to be among kindred spirits, because I see that, I'll be talking a lot along the lines of what Rodolfo and Professor Celine have highlighted. So we're a campaigning alliance based here in the Philippines. So we're no stranger to climate change, and we, in fact, topped the list last year of the 2022 World Risk Report of the countries facing the highest disaster risks. We count among the South countries who were falsely promised climate finance amounting to a paltry 100 billion a year by 2020. So with this pledge, as we know, largely unmet by the rich countries, climate change costs have skyrocketed to an estimated $5 to $10 trillion per year by 2060. So also in this list is Pakistan, which, as you know, is also in very dire straits. And we were just talking with colleagues yesterday, and there are now long queues for food and fuel, and people even collapsing while lining up for these very basic needs. So it's a concrete example of how mutually reinforcing the debt and climate crisis are. We see from the UNICEF report that 6 months after the monsoon floods that were exacerbated by global warming and glacial melt, more than 10 million people are still without access to safe drinking water. So children are particularly vulnerable to waterborne diseases. No? And so we're faced with this question: how does this square with the $22 billion that the Pakistan is compelled to pay this year in external debt obligations? How do we, how does this logically play out when the IMF will collect more than 300 million in surcharges from Pakistan because their levels of debt are way over their quota, and because they're not paying on time? So Pakistan is not alone, and as the climate crisis becomes more acute, we also see this happening in a context of debt accumulation and greater debt dependence. No? So, for example, among low and middle income countries in East Asia, the Pacific, and South Asia, they broke records at 1.23 trillion as of end 2020, which is almost their entire exports for that year. In the same period, they paid 115 billion in debt service to IFIs and private lenders, or 98 billion more than in 2019. So the challenges are indeed massive, and so we welcome that there's this growing consensus globally that we face an enormous challenge to meet global development and climate goals, and that secondly, there's growing consensus that the finance currently offered is nowhere near the massive amounts that are needed. But like Professor Celine, I think it's also important to look back, no? That at every document that the World Bank puts out there, or other IFIs, that that they've somehow gained an epiphany, and decided to go on bolder moves, that this should not prevent us from looking back. So my first problem with the evolution roadmap is questioning the credibility of the World Bank. The structural adjustment policies, the impacts of that did not only happen like a decade or so ago. The effects of that are continuing. So in the privatization of our essential services, for example, that constrain women's access to water, that stands to this day. In the privatization of our energy systems, that continues to this day. So it's sometimes we call what the World Bank has done and other IFIs, sometimes we call those continuing crimes. maybe Professor Celine could also talk that, in the sense that the impacts of what they did in the past should not be forgotten, and there's continuing harm being done from the original policy implemented. So I just want to stress that it always seems as if this twin crisis of debt and climate developed overnight. For debts, we know that there was really aggressive peddling of loans to the South. Not only, we of course do not absolve our governments, but we also know that they were really pushed to borrow. And this was justified that Southern economies need capital infusions for development and to address poverty. And it even goes way back to our colonial history, as Rodolfo mentioned. And over the years, over decades, this unequal relationship has established the structures and frameworks of domestic economies, which have led to a net outflow of wealth from south to north, and the plunder of the South's resources, the exploitation of our labor, aided by the complicity, of course, of our own elites, of the domestic elites. So we are straitjacketed. We are straitjacketed from charting our own development path by illegitimate debts, the burdensome debt servicing, and the conditionalities that are imposed upon us. So if we take this Southern perspective, the view shifts, from looking at the debt problem narrowly as just about insolvency and lack of liquidity, to seeing it as a really a political issue, as Rodolfo said, concerning steeply unequal relations. We see it as an issue of injustice, of lack of accountability, and of course, logically, for laying the basis for the justness of the demand for reparations. We see the debt crisis not only as portrayed as inability to pay on time, but as the crisis of peoples who are bonded to debt service, who are paying with their money and their very lives. So we must not forget that both the debt and the climate crisis are rooted in the same global economic and financial system. It's a system that we've seen and continues to this day, breeding inequalities, injustice across and within countries. No, it's a system that involves the wanton extraction of natural resources, also the destruction, for example, of natural carbon sinks, and the excessive and ever increasing emissions of greenhouse gases from fossil fuels and carbon intensive, highly profitable industries, which we can really trace the climate crisis to. So over the years, there's been a huge climate debt owed by the North to the South, and this continues to be incurred. It's important to note that payment of climate debt via climate finance is an obligation. It's not compensation or aid or assistance, nor should it be used as an instrument for the promotion and expansion of private profit. So we believe that grants-based financing must be the only acceptable modality in the provision of climate finance. There is now the struggle continues to fill the new loss and damage fund, of course, with anything that's near the fair share of what is needed to respond to climate disasters. But what is not in question is whether they can afford to. So that's often said that there's no money for that. The private sector is the one that we should go to. But we can cite a few examples like fossil fuel wealth. So even in the time of COVID, we saw these corporations making trillions of dollars, and we should also make fossil fuel companies pay. So that's another source of finance. So while many households were pushed into poverty, they made record profits. And then it's worth mentioning also that we're also campaigning on a tax on extreme wealth, which alone could raise more than $2.5 trillion a year. So these are some of the proposals, and also add to that support also for the calls to cancel the Global South sovereign debts. And then finally, we have this initiative from Mia Mottley, from Prime Minister Mia Mottley, coming from also a very climate-threatened country, to tackle debt and climate as components also of the above proposals. However, alarmingly, we see G7 countries riding on, like France, and France actually has picked India because of its presidency of G20. So it's now becoming more known as Macron-Modi Summit. No? And this is worrying that there could be railroading of these popularly supported interventions at COP28. So yeah, so that's where we are. There's no doubt that scaling up finance is an urgent concern. But what kind of finance and how such finance is sourced is extremely important and carries far-reaching implications. We think that just debt cancellations are important and concretely frees up public funds from repayments for debt, many of which would not bear public scrutiny. At the same time, we're fighting for financing for reparations, equity, and justice. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was a very extensive and comprehensive answer. There are many things to discuss in this first round of questions, but maybe in the sake of time and make sure that we have a proper Q&A session, I'll jump on the second set of questions that we prepared, focusing more on another very boiling topic, which is climate. So I'll read the question out loud, and then I'll let you, each of you, have the time to answer it. So this question is, the roadmap has defined climate as a public good, as some of you already mentioned, but it's not really specific about what climate action should be taken to protect this public good. Does this vision lay the groundwork for effective climate measures to be funded using adequate and equitable financing tools? Are there better alternative visions? So that's the first question. I noticed that some of you didn't really pick on the question about the private sector. So if you want to integrate this in your answer, please feel free. And if we see that we have enough time, we can go back to some questions and go deeper in some of the topic. So you were the last, now you're the first. So you already covered a bit this question in your intervention, but you can keep on going now, and maybe specifically addressing the climate question will be interesting. Thank you.
Okay. So just a word on the private sector. So this really, too uncomfortable. It's too business as usual. To hear again that the private sector, as putting there in the driver's seat for this our recovery. So this is still gaining traction in many arenas, no? To promoting private sector co-financing would meet the financial gaps for climate, especially for adaptation, loss and damage. So we think that this is really an injustice to the global South. This push only enables the North who failed to meet the 100 billion pledge to further evade fulfilling their climate finance obligations. And banks and financial institutions follow suit by promoting private equity financial instruments that generate significant returns for them. So this is where our positions are about the private sector being privileged, and putting our hopes there in the private sector. So we see them putting in a lot of money. For example, finance flows from the private sector amounted to at least 13 billion in 2020, and this is growing. And then there's also continued promotion of PPPs. But this is not really very alarming, because we're attracting private investors whose profit-seeking interests constrain access to essential services and leads to violation of many rights. So Eurodad has also put out a study on PPPs, which have proven costlier for the public purse, riskier for the public sector, and thus burdensome for citizens. So that's what we see. The problem is with still sticking to this recipe of about the private sector being given a greater role, to address systemic and structural issues. Now, on the other question on the global public goods, am I still on track? Yeah. So well, if you look up IMF's definition of public goods, and I think this is also from many decades ago, that these are goods that are available to all, or what they call non-excludable, and can be enjoyed over and over again by anyone without diminishing the benefits they deliver to others, which they call non-rival. The problem is that how these supposedly public goods are now treated is that they become excludable and rival. This also links about the question on climate finance. The climate system is such a public good crossing national and global boundaries, but it is not equally enjoyed by all because of the actions or inactions of those most responsible for the climate's destabilization, to the grave detriment of peoples, especially in developing countries. We think that it's important to not only to define climate as a global public good, but within that, putting stress also on adaptation as a global public good. We now see that a lot of the climate finance being raised, and also this speaks to Prime Minister Motley's mitigation trust. We already see that a lot of climate finance is going more into mitigation. So while this may help countries shift, it does not help countries adapt or face future risks. No? And this should reflect in providing more grant-based climate finance for climate actions, addressing the vulnerable countries' disproportionate exposure to the climate crisis. There are already, the responsibilities are very clear in the climate convention that that in line with common but differentiated responsibilities and resource capacities, it really lies on the rich and industrialized countries to deliver climate finance, to cover the costs of adaptation and loss and damage in the global south. So we also see that it's really a great benefit as a public good, for adaptation to be given more stress, as we can see the possibilities of its contributing in a big way to poverty reduction if it is not financed by debt or recycled climate finance or ODA, or left to the whims of the private sector. At the same time, there must also be bold mitigation actions to accompany that. Finally, we think that the human rights and justice framework needs to come into the picture. This is what we find sorely lacking in the evolutionary roadmap, because the IFI seem to be exempt from this framework. They are also immune from suit. So this is really problematic in such a document that claims to take on bolder, even transform the ways that things that have been done, but we find it's really more closer to business as usual. So yeah, so that's it from my end.
Thank you very much. I'll give now the floor to Celine to pick up on this question as well. And if you want to address the question about private sector as well in your answer, please feel free. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I think because I dropped out, I hadn't heard that you had rolled 2 questions into the first one. So yeah. So with the private sector, yeah, I have some thoughts about that. I think, the whole leveraging private sector finance, mobilizing private sector finance for sustainable development is really highly problematic from all the things that May had talked about, but also from a governance perspective. I'm just going to pop a link to a policy brief that I did, and I think Fawaz just popped a link onto a paper that I wrote, and it's open access, so you can access that. But I'll share that in the link. But there are really significant, beyond just the kind of debt, financial, economic implications of using private finance to finance public goods, basically, like climate action. I think, there are some real regulatory and governance implications that we really need to think about. I mean, the first one is really that the shift to private finance will actually reduce the policy space for national development planning and the policies and the participatory and consultative space for prioritizing national development strategies and development finance and climate action, because you're ceding a lot of this space to the markets and to private investors. So my question would be, with more and more private investors coming in, who's setting the agenda for what goods and what sectors get funded and which priority? Because what you're getting is we will have increasingly, private investors dictating, or, even if they're not actively dictating, you'll be very much dependent on whether the investments in that particular sector are favorable, are profitable, or are suiting the strategic and economic interests of the private investors that you're trying to court. And they'll be foreign, a lot of them will be foreign private investors, because the domestic market in many developing countries will be so small. It will be based abroad, and these private investors, and if you're thinking about institutional investors that you're trying to bring in, these major long-term sort of institutional investors like pension funds, they're governed by their own, financial regulations in their home states, right? So they're being governed by, the pension fund regulators in their home states. They're governed by the financial conduct authorities within their home states. And so what and how they can invest will be contingent on these regulatory changes or shifts within their home states, which means actually developing countries' financial sectors are going to be much more constrained. You're not going to be able to direct investments to sectors and industries and to issues that the developing countries, have as national priorities, because you'll be dependent on that, and then you will then be dependent on regulatory shifts in jurisdictions outside your own, which you have no control over. So it's kind of, in a way, I've always said this is like lawmaking through the back door. It's not international lawmaking where countries, sit down and states sit down and develop regulatory norms that have, are then binding across different countries based on consent and and consultation with communities at home. It will be tied. You will have to make regulatory changes, because in order to attract these investors to your countries, you're going to have to adopt the standards that are being set by the investor home state. And that's really critical. That's such a shift, right, in the governance structures of countries and in international law. So that's really, really important that, we think about not just the financial and economic implications, but also the political ramifications and the governance ramifications of ceding so much power, right, to the private actors to develop this, our own national development policies, right? So and then the other the other point is that it also fragments and they weaken public expenditure accountability within home states, because again, who's dictating what sectors to fund? Solar, because some investor somewhere thinks this is a good idea, but maybe perhaps in that country that might not be what's suitable. It might be other priorities, but you get driven by externalities. And of course, there's the whole issue with the more that countries get into bond markets and capital markets for investments, and you're tried in creating new channels for financial contagion, not within the developing countries in itself, but also global financial crisis, because it's so unpredictable. And we've seen, in recent weeks, there have been 2 near misses in terms of banking, potential banking crisis with the SVB Bank and Credit Suisse. It is quite incredulous, right, to think about the fact that we're going through with these kinds of leveraging mobilization of private finance plans at the same time as you've got these near misses that have often happened at the same time. So I think we need to kind of think about the policy space implications. And just quickly on the climate finance, on the climate action public good question, again, I think I mentioned in my first intervention that this needs to be embedded within the multilateral climate regime. And I don't see that being referenced at all in the evolution roadmap. Climate finance cannot be based on an aid framework. I think May and Rodolfo had mentioned that already. We have a system where public goods are, financing, international financing for public goods are premised on an aid framework. So it's discretionary. It's not it's not obligatory, whereas actually climate finance is. If you look at the provisions of the UNCCC and the Paris Alignment, it is very clear that the commitments of developing countries to mitigate and the capacity of developing countries to adapt to climate change is contingent on the financial resources and the technology transfer from developed countries. And so climate finance needs to be a resource that is set aside as an international legal commitment by developed countries. It cannot be seen and it cannot be packaged as part of their ODA. It cannot be packaged as part of, you know, their international development finance, because it isn't that. It has to be additional as well. So if you look at, you know, the current climate finance frameworks, a lot of developed countries are classing climate finance as, you know, ODA, which reduces the amount of ODA going to other sectors like health, education, other humanitarian users. And that this is really highly problematic. And it'll be more problematic once we go on to, you know, once we adopt the kind of concessionality, you know, like reforms that are being promoted, you know, through the evolution roadmap, but also through the Bridgetown agenda proposals that, you know, we're going to give more concessional finance to middle income countries. That's fine. I mean, as a principle, that's fine, but where does that financing come from, and how would it be accounted for? If it's accounted for as ODA, then it's not okay, because that means that's reduction in ODA for other purposes in other countries, and that's completely against, you know, the commitments that have been made by countries in the multilateral climate regime. So we really do need to think about this. I think it's really, really important that we think about how, you know, the terms of this financing and how it's going to impact on national policy and lawmaking, but also at the international level.
Thank you very much, Celine. Thank you very much. That was super interesting as well, and very complimentary with my just said. So Rodolfo, I'll give you the floor now to complete. And as I said to the others, please feel free to answer both questions. We still have time to gladly go deeper in those questions, and then we can have a Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And indeed, apologies for skipping the part 2 questioning round. Largely picked up from what Celine said about, and I think also May has also explicitly described about the need to take it from a more comprehensive historical point of view, that when we talk about the private sector, this isn't a 21st century phenomenon. Like, since the World Bank lent to Chile in 1948 and onwards, until the era of structural adjustment and onwards, the interests of profit have been looming in the function of the World Bank itself. And you see that history when it has promoted privatization, deregulation, liberalization, and that itself was discredited. The World Bank promoted PPPs in the early 2000s. It's as if to repackage the same assumptions under in other new arrangements. And when PPPs, through the work of CSOs too, of course, were discredited because of the harms that were cited earlier by our colleagues, in 2015, the World Bank shifted to push this narrative of the financing gap, that indeed we cannot just fulfill aid money, we cannot just fulfill development through public money. That's why we need more private money. And so the agenda that the World Bank has promoted since 2015, which rests on that idea of the financing gap, and which does not address the fact that it's not just a matter of lacking money, but how resources, and as Celine said, policy space has been taken away from countries to pursue their own development. And so when that approach was criticized again by CSOs, etc., and when the crisis now has unraveled the faults of that same maximizing finance for development approach by the World Bank, it's now coming to us again, like May said, with this eureka moment for some reason, that it has to reform itself while still embedding the same private capital centric assumption that it has done so for decades. So if you will, I mean, to use an image, right? It's like a matryoshka doll, that Russian doll, right? That when you take out the first layer of World Bank reform, behind it is PPPs and the maximizing finance for development approach. When you take out those layers, there's still that same old assumption that benefits private capital. And that's even, and this is explicit in the roadmap itself, right? The so-called billions to trillions agenda explicitly mentioned in the evolution roadmap as something that needs to be reaffirmed and strengthened. The roadmap says that official multilateral financing must catalyze other such flows. And it explicitly reinforces and supports blended finance, which we define as using public money such as aid to attract more private. Would say that it doesn't fulfill even its own objectives, right? Blended finance attracts money mostly to sectors that are most profitable to institutional investors and doesn't really go to the sectors that are producing more development impacts. So even under its own terms, the notion of blended financing promoted by the evolution roadmap is stands on shaky ground. And as Celine said, it's important that that notion of reliance on private capital is not just a financial and economic question, but a political question. And we know that market power translates to political power, and this is the character of the history of neoliberalism and up to now. And aside from the erosion of policy space in southern countries, this also means that the right of peoples to shape and contribute and influence their own development processes are being eroded. So that actual fact of the right to development, where it should be us, right? Should be the workers, peasants, indigenous peoples, women who are shaping our own development path. That itself is being eroded by the continuing dominance of bank. For instance, in the Philippines, since I also live in the country where May also lives. No, the past few months there are conversations about pushing to allow foreign ownership over broader sectors of the economy, and we see this as an byproduct of the historical drive to attract more private investors in our country. So in that fashion, when you talk about the evolution, has been doing for decades. And actually, for us at IBON International, we think that the World Bank reform now proceeds from a silent denial by us, shoving under the rug this history and these realities that the World Bank has been doing. Cost so much. And so we agreed to that idea that the question behind the private sector and the World Bank is really, should there be more of this really amid our crises? Is it really a time to legitimize these paradigms, or a time to reject when it comes to the private sector? I want to use this image here of a glass onion. I don't know if you've seen the movie, this Hollywood movie called The Glass Onion, which is also based on a Beatles song. But a glass onion is essentially a metaphor for, there's an onion, right? A multi-layered complex thing. But if it's made of glass, it's actually, from certain points of view, from certain angles, you can see right through it. And the simplicity behind the so-called complexity. And I think World Bank reform is like that. It's a glass onion. And behind its complexity and multi-layeredness is the fact that it just gives new license to the discredited paradigm that we are suffering from. This paradigm that benefits monopoly capitalism in a time where the dominant shareholder of the World Bank, the United States, is in strategic decline. And this is a time where that's why when they Malpass, the former World Bank director, has been discredited due to his own comments about climate change, the US has to be quickly replace him with Ajay Banga, and has been backed by Germany and the UK, and is now being rejected by Russia. So that geopolitics, to benefit the dominant shareholder of the bank permeates, we think, this conversation about the private sector and World Bank reform. Since, as I've mentioned in my first intervention, the United States is one of the biggest beneficiaries of wealth transfers, wealth drains from the global south up to now. And this puts me to my response to the climate. Since the same paradigm, we think, permeates the World Bank response on climate action and climate in general. aside from what my colleagues have already discussed, we could talk about I think some of them already discussed the World Bank's history of financing actually fossil fuels, coal financing via the IFC, which it has done so for millions and millions of dollars already. And aside from that, the World Bank up to now is financing false solutions, right? It's supporting false solutions to the climate crisis. The World Bank continues, for instance, to finance mega dams. And I mean, again, to go back to my country in the Philippines, in the first place, the World Bank has not been held accountable for such harmful projects. I always tell this story about this Chico River Dam that is funded by the World Bank. This is a project way back in the 70s and the 80s. And it was one of the earlier high-profile cases that we see that the World Bank is financing a dam that is taking away indigenous people's lands, drowning them if the project was continued. And the indigenous peoples in northern Philippines bravely fought that back, and that forced the World Bank to stop the project in the 1980s. But the peoples were not left unscathed because it involved the killings of indigenous leaders who opposed the dam. So, this kinds of project financing by the bank that has harmed people's communities, it's continuing now in various countries, And with Eurodad and other colleagues, we have done research on such PPPs, for instance, that are continuing to do the same harms to communities up to now in the name of energy, in the name of sustainable energy. And the World Bank is also supporting carbon credit markets, right? In the roadmap, the World Bank is proud that it has pioneered, the roadmap would say, pioneered green bonds, blue bonds that are actually ways of financializing and relying on volatile financial markets in the name of responding to the climate crisis. So for us, in terms of the climate question, right? The question is, even if we accept the notion that climate should be a global public good, the question for us is the World Bank fit for purpose for that? Or does the World Bank's record show rather that we should be skeptical about its continuing role in these initiatives, its interventions? And I think one problem I have with the Bridgetown is that it basically assumes that the World Bank should still be a big player in climate despite this record, right? And reiterates the reliance on private capital along the way. So we think, as our colleague in the end, as colleagues have mentioned, we should be talking about more systemic shifts, right? So we should be talking about as May said, grants-based financing, and the real rapid and deep reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by those polluters that have done so historically, especially the developed countries. And it requires providing restitution to the global south that has made the global south vulnerable to climate impacts. And it requires upholding the rights of indigenous peoples, peasants, workers, that the World Bank does not have a good record of protecting those rights. And we should end this financing of all solutions to the climate change that are reliant on volatile financial markets. And what's funny in the evolution roadmap is the hype. Despite all these, the hype still about the role of the private sector. The roadmap would say something like this, right? The private sector is the bringer of financial and technological innovations that could be game changers. That's a direct quote, right? Game changers to tilt the balance towards a sustainable planet. So to end, I ask, really, the corporate giants and the financial oligarchy that is responsible for ecological collapse are now, for some reason, the game changers? And I ask that rhetorically, of course, and I know you know the answer to that question. So I stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Rodolfo. A very good rhetorical question to end your point. Very good. We'll start now the Q&A, if that's fine. Thank you all already for all your contribution. I see they were very complementary and building on each other. So it's a very good way to give a good overview of the problems and the gaps. So I have here a first question coming from the audience. So I read it out loud and then we can see who wants to address it first. I think it's good for you three. So the recent initiative is very popular, but is it just more loans for climate finance? It would be great to hear from the speakers about any critiques you may have on the recent initiative. So who wants to go first? I can designate, or if any one of you wants to start.
I've just provided some comments in the chat, I think, the Q&A. And I think I'll just read them out. I mean, I think that the principles are good of the initiative. I mean, the main principles are good, but I think the devil is always in the detail. And the operational proposals are not necessarily aligned with what the principles set out to achieve. And I think that's where the problem lies, because you can have broad-based, principles. From what I've seen, the kind of operational detail that is coming out in terms of fleshing out how you operationalize some of what you've asked for is pretty much based on the standard, mainstream, let's leverage private finance. And I think without these kind of accompanying reforms at the structural level, this is tinkering around the edges, and it's tinkering around the edges because it's making the proposals fit to what, sort of mainstream traditional financiers want to hear. And that's not very radical, and actually quite dangerous, because then it shuts off, the radical debates and the need for revision at the very sort of like systemic level. And I think just one example, I think, the climate resilient debt clauses, the CRDCs that they've mentioned, I mean, it's a contractual means, and it fits into the kind of whole market, let the market participants decide. And it's not controversial in themselves if they don't increase the cost of borrowing. That's a separate issue as to whether it does or not, if they're included into new bond series. I mean, but like the collective action clauses, the CATs, which were introduced because there was a need to stymie debate on sort of a more statutory approach to debt restructuring, right? I mean, the CACs, I mean, they helped, but haven't prevented the debt crisis that we see today, because it's going to be complex. So contractual clauses are fine, but they're just like very, very much limited to the contracts in themselves. They're not encompassing, they're not universal. So that's a very market approach to an issue that without collective responses at the systemic level, you're not going to be able to make it. And let's not forget that a lot of these market proposals are based on this backstopping of private finance by public finance. So they only work if there is debt for nature swaps is the other my big bugbear, right? So they're only backstopped because they're guarantees from a development finance institution. And I think this is, again, I mean, I don't want to criticize it, again, coming from that, but our proposals should not be limited by what is pragmatically possible, because that's always been the case. And what is pragmatic is being not determined by, in fact, states or in communities, but actually by the private sector, who haven't really been, have not really covered themselves in glory in terms of, their kind of activities and over the pandemic. So, it's very, very clear they've not participated in debt in the restructuring negotiations as much as they should. The private sector doesn't do anything if it's not forced to by states. Let's face it. And we have to also distinguish between the private sector and the private sector, because a lot of these mechanisms, all these leveraging finance for private finance is not targeted small, medium scale enterprises in developing countries. They really are not. They're there to kind of in the large investors from developing countries and protecting the rights of sort of foreign investors. So again, we have to make that slight distinction as well as to what we mean by private sector and what we mean by protections for private sector too. It's basically reinforcing the asymmetries, reinforcing the system from what I see. And I'm trying not to be so cynical about it. It's just that reality that we need to kind of keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Celine. Mai, I think you have your camera on. Do you want to pick up on this question as well?
Yeah, so about Bridgetown and also about this evolution roadmap, also echoing what was earlier said about totally ignoring long-standing multilateral spaces such as the UN. So there's no mention. So this very dangerous trend of creating this non-normative space where civil society is excluded. So actually, for the Macron summit, we have some information that they control the design, the content, the program, and also is going to speak. And they're going to decide how civil society is going to participate, if at all. And we really don't know a lot of information about that. So it's because in these non-normative spaces outside of the UN, decisions are being made that of course without the voices of the South, what kind of decisions are those? No? So that's one gap there in the roadmap, and also even in the Bridgetown initiatives, and even in Bridgetown, there's also more of the same, like mentioned also about the private sector, and as we can see, so far what's interested them is climate insurance or catastrophe bonds, those kind of market-based approaches that you really see the main drivers as the private gain that they'll get out of it. So that's why also the very disproportionate investments into mitigation rather than adaptation. So those are really big gaps in these initiatives that are coming out, welcome as they are, because they foreground the urgency of the problems and the scale of finance needed. We must also interrogate more closely what is that finance, where is it coming from, and who's going to pay. We also see that nobody's mentioned the obligation of advanced countries, of the advanced economies. That's kind of like fallen off the table in the face of these proposals for scaling up finance. So an obligation that's reached consensus by 90 plus states, that is clear obligation of developed countries to deliver the climate finance for the developing countries to adapt. This is not mentioned at all. And there's all this being shadowed by, sidelined by all these proposals for the reform of the MDBs, or, going again to the private sector for the finance that we need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I can confirm that from a climate perspective, we also feel that there is like a will to distract and create a big mosaic of solution outside of the convention. This is very worrying. Rodolfo, do you want to also give a part of answer to that question?
Yes, my colleagues have answered it well. My only addition to this conversation about Bridgetown is, in my understanding, it's still built into the Bridgetown initiative remains the idea of leveraging private capital, right? And when we talk about private capital in this context, we are mostly talking about the financial markets, the institutional investors that we see today in the past few years. Has more or less been actually trying to greenwash themselves, right, if you will. We know that recent studies show that when institutional investors respond to environmental, social, and governance norms, if we can call that norms, rather ESG when they respond to ESG financing, they are mostly doing it at surface level, but not really they're aligning themselves to ESG just because it's now the call of the times to align to impacts. So from that end, we, especially under the time of a volatile financial market globally, that twin reality of greenwashing and volatile financial markets we think that's one thing that the initiative does not have going for it. And otherwise, we remain, we think it's necessary to still monitor it, continue to explore prospects and limitations of such initiatives. And thirdly, the problem with the climate finance today, right? Many are coming from private sources, and many are in loans. So if you're going to rely on more bond markets, that reinforces the current problems of the climate finance architecture itself. So I end it with that.
Thank you very much to you three for answering comprehensively this first question on the Bridgetown initiative. I have a second question from the audience. So, is it acceptable for multilateral development banks to have poverty defined at levels that are not living wage levels, and are they justifying exploitative minimum wage, for example, in the case of Sri Lanka? Someone wants to pick it on this one? So having MDBs to have poverty defined at levels that are not at living wages levels, and that they are justifying exploitative minimum wages. And we have an example of Sri Lanka that I'm not aware of what was mentioned in the audits.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about this, to be very honest, which is my problem. But maybe, I don't know, other panelists, I don't, Fawa might have some thoughts on this. But yeah, I mean, I think there are problems with statistical measuring of poverty anyway, as a measure. The use of the World Bank kind of thresholds, I really haven't given much thought, but that's food for thought for me now.
Maya or Rodolfo, do you have any reflection about this question? It's a very broad one.
Yeah, so there's and I'd like to credit also civil society for pushing that poverty be defined as multidimensional, and there's been a response to that in the multidimensional poverty index of the Asian Development Bank. But of course, it's really something it's very, very unacceptable, to say the least, that poverty is defined as such. No, as we know, it's not only income poverty; it's also the health, education, access to water and sanitation. So all those are interlinked, which makes for a decent life. So for example, the definition of poverty that does not bring in the right to water is practically saying that they're not, when the right to water is practically akin to the right to life. So we have campaigns around pushing for those rights, and this also actually connects with how we criticize the debt sustainability assessment frameworks that only see capacity to pay narrowly and do not look at other indicators of human well-being, no, or of the planet. So it does not bring in the crisis of people's living in poverty and still living in poverty, exposed to the crisis of climate, and still being compelled to pay. So whether if we get more concessional finance, those are still debts. Those are still debts, and we must always go back and claim the obligation of developed countries to deliver the climate finance that South countries and vulnerable countries need. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. Rodolfo, do you want to pick up on this as well?
Yes, thanks. I interpret this question also in light of the evolution roadmap. A part of the evolution roadmap claims to broaden the definition of the World Bank about poverty, right? So from its long-standing definition of extreme poverty by $1.90, which it upgraded to $2.20, I think recently. By it wants to include the poverty levels that are mostly felt at middle income countries, right? Which in older World Bank definitions would be the $5.50 rate, and which it has recently increased to around $6, adjusting for inflation. So I mean, at surface level, the evolution roadmap tries to nominally respond to a higher poverty line, if you will. But indeed, my response to this would have been around what May already said, that we are not just, when we talk about poverty, we're not just talking about narrow income lines, but we're also talking about whether you eat, whether you live in a home wherein you could live well, whether you have access to water, whether your surroundings, your environment, your community has not been plundered by mining companies, etc. Whether you live, whether you have the right to determine your own development path, etc. All of those bear on poverty. But I also agree on the framing of this question that an important conversation about poverty is also about living wages, because for the longest time, the World Bank has promoted labor flexibilization, integration of our countries into global value chains, production chains, where for the most part, wages are really poverty wages. And the question of living wages also bears on what I mentioned in the overarching narrative that I'm trying to pursue in this conversation, that the history of the World Bank cannot be divorced from the history of extraction of wealth. And keeping wages low, as the World Bank has done so for so long, as the World Bank has supported for so long, de facto, is one way to exploit peoples and drain wealth from the global south. And we see that up to today, there is rampant wage inequality around the world. So I really feel this issue about living wages and workers, especially today when most are relegated into informality, right? And by the way, to give an example, did you know that the World Bank supported the Omnibus Law in Indonesia, and has actually released a public statement in support of it? And it's a law that has eroded labor rights, eroded union rights. And that's one example where up to today, the World Bank is undermining its so-called objective of addressing poverty and addressing the rights of workers, because its track record has been the opposite for the most part. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Celine, if you want to have some reflection about this question as well, or you got some food for thought for a leader. All right. I have another question from the audience. It were actually already partially answered by all of you, but maybe I can bring it up again and you have maybe additional things to say. So do you think the World Bank has the correct vision and tools, so it goes broader than the evolution roadmap, to become a true climate leader? So as I said, it was partly addressed in the third question, but maybe you want to emphasize something or repeat something that was very important to remind for the audience.
I think we need to kind of be very careful about assigning these new roles to existing multilateral institutions that are not made or don't have the expertise and are not geared up to deal with these issues. The issue of climate finance is very, very clear in the multilateral climate regime. It has to meet the, like the obligations that countries have made under the UNCCC and the Paris Agreement. So we've got to base climate finance and the distribution of climate finance on the obligations and the principles that are contained in the multilateral climate regime. This means common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It has to be new and additional. There are a whole load of, like agreed commitments that have been made by developing countries and developed countries under the regime. And there is a financial mechanism under the UNCCC that is under the supervision of the Conference of Parties. So I think the problem is that when you don't have the alignment, and I say alignment, in a progressive sense, not in the way that, some of the IFIs and the MDBs are using the Paris alignment term. You've got to make sure that, if we don't have that, if we're not centering the delivery of climate finance under those multilaterally agreed principles, then it's really highly problematic. Then we're ascribing, we're loading up institutions that don't have the mandate, they don't have the expertise to be able to deal with this. And it will undermine other development efforts. So there's not going to be an equitable transition to decarbonisation because they're not going to be built on those principles. So I think in terms of the World Bank's engagement in this, we have to embed all the conversations about whether MDBs and IFIs are in the right, correct, in the right position to deliver this finance under those commitments, because we don't, I think there's been parallel tracks that have been happening, and the debt groups and the finance groups are not necessarily, having that conversation with those groups that have been working on climate negotiations for a very long time, and vice versa. I think the climate groups have not necessarily been engaged in the finance arena. So this is a great opportunity, I think, what Eurodat is doing to kind of bring, those two constituencies together, because I think it's really important for that, to deliver on a just transition. There needs to be the corresponding attention being paid to those principles. And the problem with, this kind of like segue into the MDBs, the segue into, any sort of like climate club conversations, the just economic transition partnerships that are happening. All that goes to May's point that you're closing off these more democratic spaces for these conversations. And the UNCCC is a democratic space. It's a participatory space. Civil society organizations are there. They're being monitored. They're more democratic. It's much more accountable. The financing is much more accountable. The resource flows are being tracked, and commitments of developed countries and developing countries are being tracked in that forum. And shifting that is a way of shifting away accountability for climate finance. So that would be my one sort of plea, is that what is happening now is actually closing off a more democratic space for conversation and policy making.
Yeah, indeed, I can just fully agree. Maya, Rodolfo, do you want to also emphasize something regarding that question? A lot has been said already, but it's a very transversal. So.
Yeah, so I think I already mentioned my reflections before, but what I'd like to stress that I think we have not mentioned earlier, and which I also find absent in the evolution roadmap, is gender. So I don't know if I'm looking at the wrong document, but I think that that's a huge gap, that there is no mention of women and gender. They're the buffer force in crisis, the ones most harshly impacted by crisis, facing discrimination in many countries here in Asia, for example. And it's the poverty also has a women's face. They also face time poverty, and so it's still up to this day, with all the treaties in place, with all the talk of the World Bank about women's empowerment. This still remains that it is simply assumed that women will take over the slack when public services, for example, are no longer available and are privately provided. So it's still women's time, women's bodies, and women's labor. And these are important components of any effort that claims to be evolutionary or provides a roadmap for recovery beyond and beyond. Thanks.
Thank you. Rodolfo, do you want to go on the climate leader question?
Yeah. If you check the October version of the roadmap, Paris is mentioned 0 times. And when you look at the more recent March 2023 document, it's mentioned only 2 to 3 times. So only after the stark criticism of CSOs as to that absence. So I mean, that's a superficial analysis, right? But that alone shows how the World Bank fits in what our colleagues are talking about in terms of the multilateral climate finance conversations and climate action conversations. And my only addition to that is the notion that I think one thing that the World Bank hasn't been held accountable to is how its long-term development model has undemocratic to the point that it has prevented greater public participation in development processes, including in charting what forms of climate action should be appropriate for our countries. It has long backed governments that have horrible human rights records, governments that, for instance, now are killing environmental defenders, indigenous peoples, peasants who should be major actors in determining any climate shift. And I think, that's because of course the World Bank that won't admit that. That's one thing that we think the World Bank should be held accountable to before we talk about whether it should be in the climate conversations. Have you, the World Bank, enabled the participation of these people that should be the leaders in climate conversations, or rather have your historical record rather eroded the chances of their participation? And how can these peoples go to the UNFCCC processes when they are being killed in their communities? Those kinds of questions. So for me, that's an addition that would like to add to this table. Thanks.
Thank you. Once again, your answers are very complimentary, so it's very comprehensive.
Yeah, can I just add as well that we
Sure.
need to be really careful about green conditionality through the back door. So I think that's one of the things that, when you're bringing in MDBs and IFIs, there is a way. This is reinforcing the power of the MDBs and the IFIs, and it's bringing in green conditionality, and green conditionality is problematic in many, many ways as well for the Global South.
Thanks for this addition. It's very important. I have now a question that's a bit going back to what was adding into the conversation. Do you think the World Bank's proposed new vision goes far enough on gender equality? So Maya, you partly answered that in your answer, but maybe Celine, as you were the last to have the floor, do you want to address that as well?
I don't think that any of like the World Bank in itself, in any of its policies, address gender, or so in a very marginal way, and it doesn't take into account the gender dimensions of the structural things, austerity and everything else that it does at a more deeper level that is not so. You can talk about women's financial inclusion, which they do, and they have discrete projects. You can talk about women's participation in political systems, which they have, and it's a very discrete project. But what the World Bank doesn't do, and none of the MDBs do really, is actually look at the gendered impacts of the kind of economic policies that they impose, and the structural conditionalities, the austerity, the limits, the debt, the impact of debt on women in general. So yeah, I think they will say gendered empowerment, but they don't mean gendered empowerment from a structural transformation perspective.
Thank you. Rodolfo, you want also to answer this?
I think Celine already answered it well. Yeah, austerity is is one thing that's haunting this roadmap, where it seems to be more about financing capacity, but really, how has its financing eroded really women's rights and its our women's access to social service for so long. So Celine put it very well already.
And just to, sorry, I know May has her hands up. I just wanted to link that to, what we were talking about in terms of when I was talking about the financial, policies being driven by financial investors, and where, what states will then prioritize. And if you're looking at foreign, private investors to invest in sustainable development, issues and investments in countries, then gender issues of women's empowerment or gender issues, they're just not going to feature as much in terms. It will be very, very basic. It won't address the structural things. So again, it is one of those things that will not be addressed because they will fall off they're not strategic things or commercially viable in projects to invest in.
I'll let you finish maybe in close if you want to answer.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, just a short one that we must really also watch out for the way that women are instrumentalized, that they have to be empowered, that they have to be given all these benefits because they can contribute to growth. So that's, I think, also very much in the dominant discourses that we need to resist and expose. Thanks.
Thank you for this part. I think Farwa Ciel has now a question for the panelists, so I'll let her the floor.
Yes, hi. Thanks a lot for a very, very interesting conversation. I think this is the kind of conversation that we don't see in a lot of very mainstream literature, which is trying to look at the technicalities and not looking at the impact, especially on people living in developing countries. And there were really, really interesting points. For example, Rodolfo was mentioning the omnibus law in Indonesia. And I just wanted to do a little bit of wrap up and then also take some question on the green conditionality which are being posed in the chat. So going back on the omnibus law, I think it was interesting that that law alone, which was actually engineered to support the World Bank's ease of business report and the whole formulation that comes under it, required 37 laws to be changed within Indonesia. And these were tax laws, labor laws, and the kind of adjustment that happens once in an economy then is not replaceable, right? You have to really then work from the grounds to root to then address these problems. You have to really change the structural transformation that comes in once. So I think in these contexts, focusing on poverty indicators or metrics then doesn't make sense because it was narrow and you've broadened it, but you've not addressed the ongoing impact or you have not reversed the problems. So that's one. But actually, I wanted to ask the panelists what they actually think about this idea of reform. Because in a sense, the World Bank evolution roadmap, the Paris Financial Pact is trying to present the evolution as reform of the financial architecture. And if we agree that this is not reform, then what actually is reform? Considering that some in the global south would say that maybe these institutions actually cannot be reformed, right? And Rodolfo's paper on this is very, very interesting in addressing this issue of a very G7-led consensus. That's one, but also I think we have a real problem with the Bridgetown initiative, which is actually in a way trying to come from some developing countries' perspective, but is limited to a few actors. So it's not actually amending the structural problems that we're faced with, but it is coming from a Southern perspective. And we know that these things are not so easy in terms of a simple North and South divide, but it's much more complicated. So just sharing some thoughts here. You can choose to pick some points, and then we have some questions again in the chat. Thanks. I think you are a bit pressed for time looking at all the questions. So maybe we can take the question on green conditionalities and the one on the Bridgetown, because Bridgetown seems to be very popular. We have two questions on Bridgetown, one by Matty and one by Gaia.
Do you guys first wants to answer to Farwa comments and then answering specific questions, maybe?
Yeah, sorry, which I think we're all trying to read the questions in the chat. Yeah, I mean, in the reform, so I think Farwa, you're right. I think, like for me, it's seeing, it's what's new about this. And what was really striking for me, just having a quick look at the Financing for Sustainable Development report, the UN FSDR that's come out, that actually when you're reading it, you just see there's very little difference in the sort of proposals that are being made now across the different, global governance institutions. And I think that's really highly problematic because they seem to be coalescing around a general consensus that we need to leverage markets for development, and MDBs play a role, and this whole public-private partnership endeavor is a good one. And I think, I'm not exactly sure where these reforms are heading or how, but I do think that there needs to be a conversation that needs to be had about whether, having these replacing these institutions with institutions that are just going to do exactly the same thing, or reforming or tinkering around the edges. And I think those of us who have been in this game for a long time have just seen the same reiterations over and over again. And yeah, I think it's really very problematic to see, and it's quite disappointing to see that a progressive initiative like Bridgetown, in terms of operationalizing it, and again, I don't have a problem with the principles in general. I think they're very, very good principles. I think the operationalization of the principles has been driven by a sort of pragmatic drive, or a so-called pragmatic drive that, if you can't beat them, we have to join them. But which is really, really problematic on so many fronts, right? Because it doesn't take into account, the kind of the starting points of different countries, the continuing asymmetries at the international level, both geopolitical and economic, and also legal. And it doesn't take a very integrated and holistic approach to the issue of the financing gap. And it just seems to be very clear in all these conversations that we have and all the reform proposals that there is no real look at the systemic issues. And we go back to this, 20 years ago, people were talking about this, 30 years, people were talking about this, 10 years ago, people were talking about this, when the pandemic hit, we were talking about it. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I think maybe I'm just a bit tired, and I can imagine you guys who've been doing this more sort of activist advocacy, you're just more tired than me to look at it. But I think, actually drilling down and pulling out the points and saying, well, look, principles are okay, they're good, right? But actually the operationalization is problematic. And why is it being discussed in, the World Economic Forum rather than at the UN, for example? I think that's a problem.
Thanks. Rodolfo, I see you have your mic on. So this is the last comment you can give. So either reacting on what Farah has said, either reacting on one question, either giving us a conclusion speech, as you like.
Yes. Thanks. I think one of our points of critique about the evolution roadmap is also along the lines of what Celine, it's like homologous to what Celine said. Like the evolution roadmap wants to broaden the World Bank's mission to expand poverty lines, respond to global public goods. But when you talk about the two other things that it wants to evolve, supposedly its operational model and its financing model. We see there, that's where, you know, the devil is there. So we see this in two possible analyses, right? So you either see this this tension as incoherence, right? So as a policy fault, or from a more social movement lens, that social movement hat that I put here. I'm quite worried that the notion of a better vision is being used as a license to forward the same problematic and operational and financing model that has been wrong for so long. So I mean, that is, the good mission is being used to forward the same system in the big picture. And I think that's, in that sense, right, that's what I think I'm trying to point out here for the whole time, that so-called evolution is not really evolution. And Parva is saying that, alluding to reform, and when you say reform, it has to be changes for the better, right? So so-called reforms in countries that are actually led to the detriment of peoples. So in what sense are those really reforms if they did not really benefited or fulfill the rights of people? So that's one notion of reform. And the other notions, are they hopeless cases about making them better in a way that serves, I think what I could see as a, you know, I think we would all be on the same page here that we want a better world. We want a world where rights of peoples are being fulfilled, including our right to development, to self-determination, etc., etc. So, I mean, on that regard, I agree with Celine here, and I think my so-called internal changes for the bank have been about its promotion of the same old system that benefits monopoly capitalism. And you know, we're quite frankly, at least me, I'm quite you know, I'm not expecting any significant change for these institutions that could tilt them to benefit people's rights, because in their history from the Cold War up to the present has been about promoting the same model, and that even if the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s, the same model about integrating these former Soviet countries to from our perspective in the peace institutions, or to reckon rightly called continuing harm, to reduce their influence, reject new intentions, and question their mandate by bringing up, really going back to their history from a people's perspective about what did it really mean they're continuing doing the same things that they have been doing today. Why should we allow them to? So I put it in that sense, and especially in the Philippines, to even go to, calling to keep history, the parallel history of how social movements think should be institutions and what they mean for us as people. So I stop there.
Thank you very much. Sadly for me, we're a bit patchy at the end, but I think we all got your main message, and thank you for your great contribution. May I can give you the last word, and then I will do a quick wrap up.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So this is also partly in response to Gaia, that one area that we're developing is to precisely put up a counter narrative to this dominant consensus forming. And we've initially called it Beyond Recovery, Fight for a Better World, Financing for Reparations, Justice, and Equity. So it's still in its very early stages, but once we have, the requirements in place, you will surely know more about it. So we hope that through this platform, a civil society across different countries and debt and climate social movements can come together to challenge the ways that the climate is being used to continue with the massive lending and also with the dominance of the private sector and corporations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you again to all of you three for this great contribution. I think it really allowed us to get a better understanding of the challenges, the obstacles, the risks, and the recommendations civil society can have towards this new roadmap and towards the financial reform in general. So thank you for that. The first thing I have to say is that we are planning such a webinar as well in May, after the spring meetings, because I believe many things can evolve. Is going very rapidly in many areas. So it's important to convene those kind of calls regularly to make sure that we keep track, that we build advocacy strategy all together. As you say, Mai, we need to be cross-cutting in those issues and bring a different constituency, as you said, Celine, together. So I'll thank you for that. I think it was very useful. It was as understandable and accessible and very precise and in-depth intervention. So I really thank you for that. I thank you, I thank Eurodat as well for organizing this. I think it was a very timely and well-led. So thank you all for this great webinar. And I hope to see you all soon in May then. Thank you all and have a great afternoon, evening, or morning if you're there very early. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.